Hi, my friends. Well, now let's do as I promised and start our study in Mark's Gospel. And I apologize for being so late tonight. I know a lot of you that stream it live will probably have to watch it later. Well, as I said, the Gospels are essentially a news bulletin, and therefore it's something that should always be read aloud, as news bulletins are. The first gospel to be written was Mark's, which is what we're going to look at today. I realize in the Bible it puts Matthew first, but in chronology, Mark was written first. Mark is interesting. He's primarily telling us what Jesus did. In Mark's gospel, Jesus is the action man. And then Matthew and Luke come along, and they're more interested in what Jesus said. Matthew was interested in Jesus' preaching, and Luke was more interested in his parables. Finally, along comes John, and he was far more interested in the person of Jesus, what he was, and therefore, in a sense, Jesus from the inside. Whereas Matthew, Mark, and Luke are looking at Jesus from the outside, as people saw and heard what he did and said. But John gets right inside Jesus, and somehow you understand, pardon me, my eyes are burning. You understand who Jesus was much better in the fourth gospel. Matthew saw Jesus as the King of the Jews. Mark sees him as the Son of Man. Luke saw him as the Savior of the world, and John saw him as the Son of God. So that's the viewpoint of these four gospels, and gives us a more complete picture of Jesus, a four-dimensional portrait of Jesus. Put them all together and you begin to understand this amazing person, who incidentally, if you didn't know, has 250 names and titles. Nobody's ever lived who had as many as that. It's a good devotional exercise to write them all down sometime. Most people can remember about 30 to 40 names, but there's 250. No one in history has ever had so many names and titles. And as we know, what an amazing person Jesus was. Well, we're going to look at first of all, the writer's angle, and then we're going to look at these gospels from the reader's angles. So the question is, who were they intended for? Why did the authors write these Gospels? Because that would shape these Gospels quite a lot. Not just who wrote them with their different angle or insight, but who they were wanting to read the Gospel they were writing. There's a profound difference between two of them and the other two. Two of them were written for Christian believers to build upon their faith, to give them a stronger foundation in their beliefs about Jesus. Two of them are written for unbelievers. And that makes all the difference to what is said in the gospel, because the context of every statement in the Bible is the book in which it occurs. We need to put every statement in the Bible, every verse in the Bible, back into the book in which it was written. So, Matthew and John are written for believers, but again, there's a difference. Matthew's written to new believers or young believers, and it's the ideal gospel to give to someone who is a brand new convert. It'll give them a real insight into the kingdom that they've now entered into, with 5 blocks of teaching in Matthew. The first is the lifestyle of the kingdom, the second is the mission of the kingdom, and the third is the growth of the kingdom, and the fourth is the community of the kingdom. And the fifth in Matthew is the future of the kingdom, which we see. 5 wonderful subjects for new converts to study. John, the Gospel of John, however, is written for older Christians. He says that, in fact. He said, "These are written that you may go on believing that Jesus is the Son of God, that going on believing you may have eternal life." It's written to keep Christians going and keep them firm and established in the faith. Whereas Mark and Luke are clearly written for unbelievers and its effects. If you're going to give a gospel out to somebody, they need to be a believer or you need to determine, are they a believer or an unbeliever, and that should decide which gospel you give them. John's gospel is probably the worst to give to an unbeliever, and yet it's the one most people use in evangelism. Isn't that weird? I think it's only because people hope that those people will read as far as John 3:16. But there you go, that's what it is. So we're now studying the two gospels that are written for unbelievers, not for believers, and therefore these two are the two you should consider giving to someone who's interested and wants to know a bit about Jesus, what he said and what he did. So let's begin, as I said, with Mark's gospel. It was the first one written, and that the first major study at this time. The author, like the authors of all four gospels, doesn't name himself. They all drop hints somewhere as to who wrote it, but they don't name themselves as the author. It's almost as if they were saying, we want the whole attention to be put on Jesus, not us. We want you to look at him, not at us. So Mark doesn't tell us that this gospel is Mark, but we know it is, and he doesn't draw attention to that fact. Well, what do we know about him? Let's talk about John Mark. The first surprising thing is that he had three names, and one of them you would never have heard of. I'm quite sure of that. You've heard Mark. Well, that's the Latin name for Marcus, and it tells us that though he was Jewish, he did have an official Roman connection in some way, and we know that his family had a quite big house in Jerusalem and had a family with some standing, and we know that they had at least one maidservant. So here's a man with a Roman or Latin name and connection, that his family should give him a Latin name, Marcus. But his Hebrew name, for he was Jewish, was Yohanan. We know that as John Mark, Yohanan. And that means Yahweh has shown grace. God has shown grace. His third name, and I must get this right, is Kolobododactylus. John Mark Kolobodactylus. And some of you might guess what that means. Dactyl means finger in Latin, or Greek, pardon me, and that fact would mean stubby fingers. So it's sort of a sense of almost humor from God that this poor baby had stubby fingers, and yet it was from those stubby fingers that we got the first gospel ever to be written. God can use stubby fingers. So here's his three names. One is a nickname, which is Greek. One is a Latin name, and one is a Hebrew name. When Jesus died, we know there were three languages that were posted on the cross by Pilate: Greek, Latin, and Hebrew. And John Mark had those names, and he records those three languages above the cross when Jesus died. His mother, Mary, in Hebrew is Miriam, and we assume later that his father died, though his father may have been the man who carried the pitcher of water on his head when Jesus was making secret arrangements for the Last Supper. And Jesus said, "Go into the city of Jerusalem, and when you see a man carrying a pitcher, you will know. Just follow him, and he'll he'll show you the room that's been prepared." And almost certainly that upper room where the Last Supper was held was in Mark's house. Some of you may have seen it. And this is where we get the little hint in the gospel as to who wrote it. Because let's just transfer our attention to the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus on the last night before he died was praying in agony. In Mark's gospel alone, there is a most unusual little incident that while the disciples were sleeping and Jesus was praying, and then the temple guards came and arrested Jesus, It says they grabbed a hold of a young man who was dressed in nothing but a bedsheet, and he fled, escaped in the sheet in the soldier's hands, and he fled naked into the night. Who was that? Well, it must have been Mark, stubby fingers. And he must have followed them, grabbed a bedsheet and followed them to Gethsemane and hidden behind one of those old large olive trees, if you've seen the Mount of Olives. And he saw the whole thing. That's how we know what Jesus prayed. Jesus was not likely to have told anyone about that prayer, but Mark heard it. Abba, Abba, Father, please take this cup from me. And it's all down there in Mark's gospel, and he's just saying in that little incident, I was there. I was there. He ran back home naked, left his bedsheet in the hands of the temple guards. Well, that's the young man we're talking about. As a youth, he had seen Jesus, obviously, and yet he was never a leading figure in the New Testament. It's strange. He is mentioned frequently, but always as a number two, an assistant, always someone's personal assistant. John Mark was such a man. He was actually a personal assistant to 4 very great leaders in the early church. Firstly, to his older cousin. He had an older cousin named Barnabas, and Barnabas brought this young man on and trained him, and he gave him jobs to do. And then from Barnabas, Mark came to be the assistant to, believe it or not, no less than Paul. It is speculated that Paul, or Saul, and Barnabas were schoolmates under Rabbi Gamaliel in Tarsus. Years later in Rome, Mark met Luke, Dr. Luke. In fact, there's a very direct connection between Mark's gospel and Luke's gospel, as we shall see when I get to Luke. And then finally, Mark became personal assistant to Peter. Peter arrived in Rome after Paul and used John Mark as his interpreter. Mark knew Latin, Peter didn't. The Galilean fishermen were unlearned and ignorant, as we saw in Scripture. So when Peter came to Rome, he had to speak through an interpreter. And Peter came and used John Mark as his interpreter, and he translated Peter's preaching into Latin in Rome. And that's how we know the first gospel came to be written, because preaching into Latin in Rome was part of what he did. And we know that members of the congregation of the church in Rome came to John Mark and they said, Mark, would you do something for us, please? Would you, they said, write down what he's teaching and get it in a more permanent form? We'd like you to write down what Peter tells us about Jesus, because the way he's going on, we may not have him with us much longer. He's really going to run afoul of the authorities because, as you remember, this was in the days of Nero. And so they said, please get Peter's preaching down in writing, because he was one of the closest to Jesus and we want it written down. Well, Mark went to Peter, and Peter wasn't at all keen or interested. The record says that he neither hindered nor encouraged Mark to do this. So as he was saying, if you can if you like, and I'm not bothered one way or the other. So the congregation in Rome came to Mark and said, write it down, and Peter's telling us about Jesus, please, we want to keep it. Peter said, well, you can, I'm not bothered. It's actually been called from time to time the Gospel of Peter, precisely because you can hear Peter's preaching. Bear that in mind. Almost all the New Testament was spoken before it was written. And that's why it's so lively, and that's why sometimes the grammar is not so good, because it's a spoken record rather than a written. And therefore, it's meant to be read aloud. Good news is to be announced, not just thought about. And the gospel's meant to be read aloud, and when you do, it's exciting. This gospel tells you and I that Peter could hold audiences spellbound as he would told people about Jesus. Dear old Peter, he was so impetuous. I can identify him, and I'm with him, and I'm sure you can. He had what we call foot and mouth disease. Every time he opened his mouth, he put his foot in it, disease as well. So, again and again, he was so impetuous. He was the one who wanted to walk on water. None of the others did, but he was the one that asked Jesus to bid him to come out. He was the one that jumped into the water when John told Jesus, or Peter, pardon me, that Jesus was on the shore of Galilee. He was the one who got tired of waiting for Jesus to appear after the resurrection, says, yeah, I'm going fishing. Peter could not sit still. You get this breathless excitement all the way through Mark's gospel. There's one word that comes 41 times in this gospel, and that's the word immediately, immediately, immediately. Or in the older version, straightway, in the old King James. Straightway he entered into a boat, and straightway the boat was on the other side. It apparently crossed the Sea of Galilee 8 miles in 2 seconds. And everything is immediately, immediately, and you're carried along with breathless excitement. Well, that's how Peter preached, and Mark was faithful and recorded this and makes Mark's gospel the most vivid and the most alive of all 4. It's the most exciting to read aloud. I'm afraid Peter wasn't interested in long sermons, so he didn't record them. There's only one in the whole Gospel of Mark, and it must have left a deep impression on Peter for him to remember it and record it. So Mark doesn't concentrate on Jesus' teaching. There is no Sermon on the Mount in this Gospel. There's just action, 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 one thing after another. Excited and enthusiastic. This is Peter. And the different temperaments of the Christians in the early church come through these writings, even in the New Testament. This book concentrates on Peter's weaknesses and not on his strengths. Now, isn't that interesting? You'd think he would sanitize his own image. It's this book that we get, behind me, Satan. Get thee behind me, Satan. But you don't find, you are Peter, and I will build my church on this rock. So Peter was consistently sharing his weaknesses, the times he let the Lord down, but he never boasted. That's interesting, isn't it? Pardon me. You only have one denial here. So Peter is denying Jesus 3 times. We know that. And you have to read John's gospel to find where he is restored 3 times, where Jesus says, do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? You only have the denial here. It's another proof that this is the gospel of Peter that John Mark has written down. There's another Peter's interest in the Jesus miracles. There are far more miracles in the Gospel of Mark by comparison than Matthew, Luke, or John. Here are the figures. For example, there were 18 miracles in Mark, whereas the parables, there's only 4 in Mark, whereas there are 18 in Matthew and 19 in Luke. So you see that Peter's interest was in the miracles, not the parables. His interest was what Jesus did and not what he said. Furthermore, we have here Peter's ignorance as well as his knowledge. Peter did not know how or where Jesus was born. Never once in his speeches and acts or his letters does he betray any knowledge whatsoever of the birth of Jesus. Peter's knowledge began down in that deep Jordan River where Peter and Andrew were baptized by John the Baptist. And Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist. And John the Baptist introduced them to Jesus. And that's where his knowledge began. And it ended with the resurrection. And that's why in the Gospel of Mark you have no Christmas story. You have no boyhood stories. It begins where Peter's knowledge began. Peter couldn't preach the Christmas story because he was ignorant of it. He never mentioned it once. So here we have clear proof that this gospel comes from Peter. Now, having said that, Mark was very cleverly constructed, in this gospel and fitted it together, and he's given a framework to the gospel story, which is used by Matthew and Luke, and you can see what we call the synoptic or parallel gospels. So let's go on into the structure of Mark's gospel. I've tried to put it in a kind of symbolic way, yet that's not too abstract. Mark's gospel covers 3 years, the 3 years of Jesus' public ministry. But there's a very clear shape to this gospel. It all builds up over the first 2.5 years. And then in the last 6 months, everything sort of flows down from that. There's a watershed, if you like. And the story starts at the Jordan River, which is the lowest point on the earth's surface. Here, the Jordan River and the Sea of Galilee, and the story moves from Jordan River to Galilee, and then literally they're physically going uphill all the way. And finally, they go to the highest point in the Promised Land, and that's Mount Hermon. Mount Hermon, at the foot of which is this little town called Caesarea Philippi. I'm sure you've heard of it. So the whole story over 2.5 years is building up to that crisis point. 2.5 years it took them to reach this climax. As soon as that point is reached, Jesus sets his face to go to Jerusalem, and then it's downhill all the way, literally down from that high point to Judea through Perea, which is the bit of land on the east side of the Jordan. So from Mount Hermon in the north, they go east of Jordan to Perea to Judea, where Jesus dies on a cross. And 3 days later, we know he rises again. Now, what's so important about this? What was Jesus waiting for? Everything seems to be building up to a crisis, and then suddenly everything takes an entirely different course. So the last 6 months are very different from the first 2.5 years. And in fact, the last week becomes all important. There are 3 phases of the ministry of Jesus, and these 3 phases are the themes of Mark's gospel. The first phase is where Jesus is very, very popular. Thousands came and were healed. And he was the talk of the whole, not just town, the whole country. So you have this acclamation of Jesus from chapters 1 to 3, where Jesus is riding high, big crowds, very successful. Then we have a second phase where opposition begins. The first point of difference was over the Sabbath. But it soon built up, and very soon Jesus had made more enemies than friends. So then the third phase begins in chapters 7 to 9, and there's 16 chapters to Mark, where Jesus concentrated on just 12 people, 12 men. And from thousands, he spent time with just 12. So we have 2.5 years covered in just chapters 1 through 9. We have chapter 10 covering 6 months, and then chapters 11 to 16 covering the last week of the life of Jesus. Now, we've got to ask what it was, what happened around there that changed the direction of Jesus' ministry so totally. So let's go back up to the foot of Mount Hermon, a little place, I know you've heard of it, called Caesarea Philippi. It's a most remarkable place. I don't have a picture to show you. This is the beginning of the River Jordan. And this river, remember, Jordan, comes out of this mountain 30 to 40 feet wide, coming straight out of a cliff, out of a crack at the foot of Mount Hermon. And it literally seems water from the rock. The Jordan River is a strange one. It starts nowhere and it finishes nowhere. It's also an amazing sight. Actually, what it explains is that the snow on the top of Mount Hermon melts, comes down a crack inside the mountain, and comes out of a hole underneath the surface of the river. So it just looks like a river as wide as a room or something coming straight out of the cliff. Now, you would imagine that a strange natural phenomenon like that would gather around itself superstition and religious cults. And sure enough, it's been the center of pagan worship for centuries. There's a cave in the cliff face there, and there used to be temples there. There are alcoves that are carved in, just little alcoves. some of which you've probably seen. And in those alcoves, they used to put statues of gods. Two particular statues I want to talk about. One was a statue of the Greek god Pan, and to this day this place is called Peneus or Benius. The other was the statue of Caesar, and that was put there by one of Herod's 4 sons called Philip, who was given this part of the land when King Herod died. So he called the place after himself and a Roman emperor. It's called Caesarea Philippi, and that's how it's got its double name. So here we have a statue of a Greek god Pan, who was a god who was supposed to have appeared as a mortal man on earth. And we have the statue of Caesar, who is a man who's already being called a god. And one day, Jesus took his 12 disciples to that very place and said, a very dramatic scene with his back to these grottos or alcoves, "Who do men say that I am?" Now, can you see why it had to be here, with a statue behind him of a God who became as a man, and a man who was worshipped as a God? Jesus said, "What about me? Where do I fit?" And they said, "Well, many people think you're a reincarnation. I mean, you're only in your early 30s and you're so clever. You must have lived before as a great man." "Oh," he said, "very interesting. And who did I, or who was I in that previous existence?" They said, "Well, some say Jeremiah and some say John the Baptist." But Jesus says, "Who do you say that I am?" And he waited 2.5 years to ask them that question. We know the story, and it was Peter who answered it. He said, "You have lived before, but not down here. You lived up there. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." He is the first man to say that, and I hope you know who the first woman was to say it a few weeks later. Do you? It was Martha. She wasn't good at cooking, or she wasn't just good at cooking, pardon me. She is the first woman to say it, but Peter was the first man. So Jesus was now able to say to Peter, "Now I can do 2 things." He mentioned 2 things that he'd never mentioned before. He said, "I can build my church." That word was never used before. Now, he never mentioned church up to that moment. He preached, he healed, he fed the multitudes, stilled the storm, but he never mentioned that he was going to build a church. Now, he said, I can do it, because Jesus can't build his church until people know who he is. The church is built up of people who know who he is, and that's when the church began, and that's with a lovely little play on Peter's name. Peter means rock, actually pebble. Simon, or Simeon, the pronunciation, was his first name, and that means a reed shaken in the wind. But Jesus said to Simon, "You are a reed, and I'm going to make you a rock." A lovely touch, because the reeds around the water at this Jordan River were plentiful. So as soon as Peter said, "I know who you are, I can build my church, and I can die on the cross," it was the first time he'd mentioned the cross. He'd been with them 2.5 years, never given a hint that he was going to die, not a tiny hint. Now he says, "I can go to the cross." That's when Peter put his foot in it. He said, he had just called Jesus the King, the Christ, and he said, "But I'm not going to let you do that. Who is king? You are the king, and I'm not going to let you die. No fear. You can build a church on me, and yeah, but I'm not going to let you go to the cross." And that's when Jesus had to rebuke him very seriously. Now that was the watershed up at the foot of Mount Hermon. And it was then that Jesus took Peter, James, and John on up that mountain, above the snow line. And it was there, where there's always snow on Mount Hermon, that Peter said his clothes became brighter than soap powder on earth could make them. He actually used the word detergent or fuller, which is the equivalent of those days And that was because the light was shining through his clothes from the inside, and they saw his glory. And from then on, it was straight to the cross, straight down to south to die. So that's the shape of the Gospel of Mark, and it's picked up both by Matthew and Luke, and they build upon it. Some of the things about Mark's Gospel as a whole, what its value is to the Gospel to us, is number one, it gives us a clear picture of Jesus Christ. I don't know if you've ever noticed this in the Gospel of Mark, but Jesus forbade anyone to discuss who he was. You see that time and again when he healed people. Don't tell anyone who did this. Don't tell anyone. Then after 2.5 years, he says, now who am I? Who do you think I am? Can you see the way he prepared them? He wanted them to come to their own conclusion for themselves. He didn't want them to pick it up from the evil spirits or anyone else. Remember, he told the evil spirits, keep quiet. He wanted them to get it from his Father as to who he really was. So we call this the Messianic secret, as it's called by biblical scholars, and it's a feature of Mark's Gospel. Mark says he kept this secret, forbade them to tell anyone, and this way he carefully restrained their thinking until he felt they had seen and heard enough. We call this moment at the foot of Mount Hermon the Great Confession, and it was at that moment that he changed the whole scene. And therefore, the second great theme of Mark's Gospel is the work of Christ. The most remarkable feature of Mark is the emphasis on the death of Christ. Somebody said Mark's Gospel is like an express train, slowing down as he gallops for the first 2.5 years and a few pages. Then he slows down to the next few pages to cover just months. Then he slows down and the next few pages cover a week. And then the next few pages cover a day and finally hours. And you stop at the cross of Golgotha. So, he's racing through but slowing down all the time until finally he just shows you Jesus on a cross and says that it is what he came for. And there's a remarkable emphasis on both the human and divine aspect of Jesus' death. The human aspect is this. Jesus, of course, was tried for blasphemy. The same thing as in Muslim law and Mosaic law. Blasphemy deserves death. So here Jesus is on trial for blasphemy. For he says that he was God, and in Jewish law that's a capital crime and deserves death, and they tried to get witnesses to agree as to what they'd heard Jesus say about himself. They couldn't agree, and finally the judge did an illegal thing. He said to Jesus, I charge you, I adjure you by the living God, tell me who you are. And of course, Jesus as a Jew had to speak when he was adjured by the living God. And he said, are you the Christ, the Son of the living God? Jesus said, I am. And the judge or the high priest tore his clothes and said, you heard it. The Sanhedrin, the 70 men, what's your verdict? And the 70 people said, death. The problem is, the Jews couldn't put someone to death officially. They were occupied by the Romans, so they had to get the Roman signature for their death sentence. But in Roman law, blasphemy was not a crime. So what were they to do? There's only one thing to do, to change the crime, and charge him to Pilate with treason, not blasphemy. And it's Mark who brings this out so very clearly. Treason was not that he said, I am God, but that he said, I am king, king of the Jews. And that's the human side of the death of Jesus Christ. It was unjust from the beginning to the end. He was not guilty of blasphemy or treason, but that's how they got him. The divine side, however, also comes in Mark, that Jesus was sure from the very beginning that he'd come to die and give his life a ransom for many, that it had to happen, that he had to be betrayed, that God had planned it from that way from the very beginning. And there was no avoiding it. And Peter mustn't try to tempt Jesus to run away from the cross. So you get this very vivid description of the person of Jesus. And from here on, the work of Christ on the cross for us. That makes a very suitable gospel to give to unbelievers. And remember, we call the gospel the good news. There are another facet to the gospel which is worth noting, and there are two key words all the way through: fear and faith. Fear and faith, and I talked about faith the other day, they go from beginning to end as if it's facing people with a choice. What's your response to this story? Fear or faith? Do you remember stilling the storm in Mark? And Jesus stood up in the boat and the disciples said, "Don't you care we're going to drown?" Jesus said, "Why are you afraid? Oh, you of little faith." All the way through this, there's a theme that Mark's keep bringing out. Don't be afraid, believe. But at the end, where Jesus appears at the resurrection, Mark is frank enough to say that the disciples didn't even believe when they saw Jesus, and he had to rebuke them for their unbelief. It's one of his favorite sayings again and again and again. Why are you afraid? Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Just believe. So here we have a picture of the person of Christ, the work of Christ, and the response of faith rather than fear when the supernatural element enters in. Well, that's why I would always choose to give Mark to an unbeliever. If they've got no knowledge of Jesus, then here is a very basic knowledge that they need: the person of Christ, the work of Christ, and their response to both. Now, before we finish, I must deal with something that you may know or have heard of, and I'll probably get questions about it, and that's this. In Mark's gospel has a very peculiar ending. It actually ends in the middle of a sentence. In the early manuscript copies we have of the Gospel of Mark, it finishes right in the middle of verse 8 in our chapter 16. And it finishes with a strange phrase, quote, "For they were afraid of," and that's it, and it stops. But it's been tidied up in English translations. For they were afraid, or they feared, but it suddenly ends in the middle of a sentence, and it ends on this note of fear. Whereas Mark's entire gospel and theme has been to get away from fear and go to faith. And that raises the question, what happened to the rest of the story? Why isn't Mark nicely rounded off? Why, above all, are there no accounts of the appearances of Jesus after his resurrection in Mark's gospel? There's only an empty tomb and the finding of that empty tomb, but there's no mention of Jesus actually meeting them, which is very strange in a gospel. Well, there are three possibilities at least. One is that Mark meant to finish this gospel, and he maybe was arrested or something happened. And second is the possibility that Mark was actually prevented from finishing and something interrupted his writing, or that what he was writing was so important that the resurrection appearances were to Peter that we don't know where it was or when it was, but the very first appearance to a man was Peter, and there's no record of it. And maybe, just maybe, Peter thought it was precarious and so intimate and so personal that he didn't want any of the account to get out. Well, we don't know. We don't know it all, but it happened, and there are other possibilities of endings, and they have been added on to in some Bibles. You'll find one ending in one sort of translation and one ending in another. One is short and one is long, and they're simply known as the shorter or longer endings. Somebody else has completed Mark's gospel, so that's how we have got a complete story. The long one, which is usually in your Bible from verse 9 to verse 20, and the longer one balances fear with faith, though it does tell us that the disciples didn't even believe when they saw. But it does include some remarkable statements of Jesus that people don't like, and therefore they want to cast doubts on the longer ending. For example, Jesus supposedly talks about tongues here. It's the only recorded instance in the Gospels where Jesus mentions, that his followers would speak in tongues or cast out demons or heal the sick or pick up snakes and not be harmed, which happened to St. Paul in Malta, remember, when he was shipwrecked. So people don't like this. There's also a statement there that Jesus made baptism in water essential to salvation. He says, he who believes and is baptized will be saved. And people don't like that. So there have been questions cast, and we look at those and consider them. Well, though it's probably not Mark who wrote it, at least it was someone in the early church fathers that finished it, and therefore the longer ending reflects how the early church believed that Jesus ended it all, and includes things from other Gospels. There's a little bit about the road to Emmaus in here. There's a little bit about Matthew's commission in here. So it looks as if somebody had just picked out various elements from other Gospels and put them together and rounded it off to finish Mark. But when we get to heaven, we can ask, and I'm sure when we get there, we won't care. But we'll consider it here, think about it, and try to reflect on our Christian understanding. So I hope you've enjoyed my introduction to the first Gospel written, the Gospel of Mark. Tomorrow I'll go back to what's in your Bible first in the book of Matthew. Have a blessed day, and thanks for watching.